All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about the aesthetics of graph visualization. This is our basic outline. We're just going to talk about a little bit of an intro about graphs, what they are, how to visualize them, then talk about perception and cognition, and as that relates to graphs and design. And then we're going to go through some specific heuristics. So graphs and visualizations. Here's just some examples of visualizations of graphs. This is a force-directed layout. So this is actually the same graph, but they're kind of showing different things in the graphs. Here's another graph, and it is a lot more graphic in its visual appeal and more for like a print medium in this case. Graphs can also be used for things like circuit board design, just as an example. So there's lots of applications of graph drawing in terms of conveying information or laying out circuit boards. Also communication with lights and microwave and things like that. Graph visualizations have been very key in those sorts of areas. So this is an example of a graph structure, just an adjacency list. So each of these letters represent nodes, and it's a mapping of node to all of the other nodes that it connects to. This is another example of a graph structure in an adjacency matrix, where a 1 represents a connection between another node. Here's an example of that graph visualized, and you can see it's a completely connected graph. All the nodes are connected to every other node. But this is only one way to visualize it. You can also visualize it this way. So, perception and cognition. So this is more of a theoretical foundation for what we're going to talk about. There's two types of heuristics. There's syntactic and semantic heuristics. Syntactic heuristics are just simply how the overall graph should be presented, okay, and how to make it functional and readable and things like this. Semantic heuristics refer to how you want to make the visualization convey some sort of deeper meaning or insight into the structure of the graph itself. So this is the emotional design framework that was discussed in the paper. And so this was developed by a famous design thinker and psychologist. His name was Don Norman. And so he's talking about different levels of emotional processing. So we have our sensory systems, and we have our motor systems. And there are these different levels of emotional processing that he talks about. The first level is the visceral level. Okay? Visceral, it relates to these immediate reactions that we have. These are more or less involuntary reactions to things in the environment. This is things like reacting to a spider and just flinching. Okay, that's like a visceral reaction to it. But it could also refer to things that are beautiful. So Apple spends a lot of money and research in designing their packages so that when you first open that laptop, it looks very beautiful. And that visceral reaction, it affects our perception of it, and it affects the way that we like our expectations of that computer and of that product. So that would be the visceral level of emotional processing. Then there's the behavioral level. Okay? Behavioral is not so gut reaction. It's more like riding a bike. Okay? It's the result of perceptual organization. And this level is where most human behavior lies. So you could be content riding a bike, or you could be, worried or concerned or something like this. In terms of design, the behavioral level relates to how functional something is, how usable it is. It's not necessarily reacting to how beautiful or ugly a product is, but just how functional it is. It really deals with kind of the performance of products or things that we're interacting with, such as graph visualizations, for example. And then the last level is this reflective level, which is this higher level meaning. This is more cognitive, it's more intellectual. It has influence over our behavior level, but it doesn't relate directly to the visceral level of emotional processing. Those are the kind of the three levels of kind of emotional processing in this framework. When we're talking about design or heuristics for graphs and graph visualizations, these two levels relate to the syntactic heuristics, and the top level relates to the semantic heuristics. Now, if we go back and talk about visceral heuristics for a second, that talks about our perception, and there's a lot of work done by the Gestalt theorists on how we perceive things. And so this kind of breaks up into two different groupings. There's perceptual grouping and perceptual segregation. So in this principle called good figure is that even though these are just separate elements on the page, we tend to see this as one, we tend to perceive it as kind of one object, kind of one structure. This here relates to similarity, so we tend to see these things as one thing and these things another because they share something similar to each other. Continuation, we tend to see this as representing a line, for example, because it's continued in some pattern, even though they're just dots against all the other dots. Proximity, so things that are closer to each other, those things seem to be grouped perceptually in that sense. Connectedness, because these objects are connected, we tend to also group them as representing some sort of independent structure as well, which is pretty obvious for graph visualizations. And then familiarity. These two things look similar, these things don't. We tend to think that this is the same type of thing as that because they are familiar. And then when we think about perceptual segregation, symmetry is a big principle here. Because this is symmetrical, we tend to also view this as one object instead of several different smaller objects. Orientation, even though these things cross, we tend to see this as two separate things instead of just one thing. And then contour, and that really refers to what are the edges. We perceive naturally edges and things like this, even though there are no edges that exist. Okay, so these are the Gestalt principles that kind of have been developed to describe the way our perceptual system works. So it relates to that visceral level in the emotional design framework.